Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever time it is. Welcome to Changes. I am Sally Ember, EDD, and you have just joined us live or on Replay City for Changes, conversations between authors, an almost weekly video cast that may become a podcast someday when it grows up or goes sideways. And today is October 7th, 2015. Welcome to episode 44. And my guest today, I am pleased to say, is from Quebec in Canada. And his name, that he can pronounce better than I can, is also known by J.F. Dubeau. Welcome, J.F.
Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. What do you want people to know about you right at this moment?
Well, you can know that I'm my name is J.F. Dubeau, as you mentioned. It's hard to pronounce, so I prefer that people just call me J.F. I'm an aspiring author from French Canada, although I write prints mostly, actually entirely in English. I mostly focus on science fiction and fantasy. I like to explore weird themes. And just before the show, we were talking about the whole language issue, and it's just not something I engage in. So, but although my name just screams French Canadian.
It definitely does have a French background to it, and that's fine. We're happy to have people from all different backgrounds on my show. So one of the things that brought us to each other is that we both are fans of and are writing in the genre of science fiction. And I was interested because for me, science fiction is a way to write about changes in society, changes in relationships, changes in the ways we think, the way we live. Technology is relevant and sometimes crucial to those changes, but for me, it's also somewhat tangential. For some people, though, some science fiction writers, it's crucial, it's central. And I noticed that you have a graphic on your website, which I'm going to show people now just because I think it's so interesting, that you are involved in yourself as an artist creating graphics, and you are involved with other people creating art for your books, right?
Correct.
And then for this particular graphic, that is what people find when they first come to your website, it's very interesting because you have a robot, or what I would consider to be a robot, that is sort of on the splash page. And then when we go to the other parts of your website, you've got some very interesting depictions of what look to me to be machinery or odd kinds of growths, or I don't even know what. But tell me a little bit about, like, here's the robot guy on the Life Engineered. So tell me about the role technology plays in your books.
I'm trying to remember, as you were talking, I'm trying to remember there's a very popular sci-fi author, I think maybe Arthur C. Clarke, who said that the best sci-fi is the ones that don't focus on technology, but use technology to challenge how we view society. And that's kind of it's something that first I kind of noticed in some of the things I've read about your work. It's something that's what was interesting to me, is that it is something that I focus on very much when I write science fiction, even for fantasy. I like the idea of not just writing a book to write a story, although I love stories and I love narratives, but even though I don't necessarily try to have a message in my books, I don't consider myself morally smart enough to have messages. But I like the idea of using technology, like in the Life Engineered, to create worlds that make us question how things are going to develop in the future, how it's going to affect the way we think, the way we act, and basically just kind of observing the difference between today us versus yesterday us, and how that's going to translate into tomorrow us, and pushing that as far as possible.
And by us, you mean humans, right?
Exactly, like humans, and not just humans in sort of a local way, but very global, even galactic, if you will.
So you have this line in one of your stories. It's kind of, I guess, what you would call a log line or a tagline that has to do with what happens with humans' robot descendants. And how do humans get to have descendants that are robots?
Well, in a way, I think that like there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, and there's obviously a lot of movies and stories about how artificial intelligence is going to be a threat and is going to either be the enemy of humanity. And I see that as being entertaining, but probably incorrect. I've written long blog posts about how I think that actually robots, well, okay, you've got kind of two kinds of robots for automation, but if we're talking about robots as an artificial sentience and artificial intelligence, the way I feel that this is going to develop is probably kind of either as a tangential race or a form, like I describe it, of descendants to humanity. There's certain things that our fleshy, limited bodies can't do that robots can do better. So if we can create a kind of artificial intelligence or artificial sentience that can do the exploring space for us and can go into hostile environments for us, they're in many ways going to be able to, as you want your descendants to do, exceed and achieve more than you have.
Well, I appreciate that philosophy, and I understand what you mean, but I guess I'm just going to poke a little bit at the concept of descendants, which is almost always a biological or familial concept and isn't an invention, isn't a technological advance, isn't a machine. So why did you choose to use the word descendant rather than invention, or even to put progeny in quotes? Because these aren't people, these aren't our children, these aren't generations later who we become, right?
No, it's not something that we become, or even one of the biggest themes in the book actually is the idea of replacement, whether or not a more advanced artificial society like that would replace us or live alongside us. That's a lot of the themes that you see in science fiction when it comes to robots. But the reason why I'm using descendants and progeny kind of in quote, well, progeny has, I think anyways, I hope I'm not wrong, but I think progeny has more of the biological inclination and descendants more of a genealogical point of view, if you will. The reason I use these terms is that, let's say I'm building a car or building a smartphone. That's an invention. That's an object. It's a tool. But the moment, and obviously this is not something that we have really explored because we're not at that point yet, but the moment you start creating things that can think and have a discussion and potentially have feelings and emotions, it kind of blurs the line between, am I just inventing something or am I creating an extension of myself? And this becomes kind of heavy philosophical discussions.
Right, but have you seen the androids they've created in Japan? They're not androids, they're robots, but they are humanoid to the point of being almost indistinguishable from people, as in the way they look and move and speak. Have you seen those in videos?
I have, and there's kind of actually this is something that's becoming both interesting and a bit, I don't want to say irritating, but there's a lot of misconceptions about how we're building artificial intelligence. Like there's a lot of reports of robots being self-aware, but in a way they're not self-aware. They're reported as being self-aware, but they're programmed to react when they hear their own name, which isn't the same thing. No. The same way some of these robots built in Japan are made to look human and have human emotions, but we're not necessarily talking about sentience. No. What I'm talking about is when we can, it's not even just about passing the Turing test. It's when there is undeniable proof that somehow we've created something that is not just intelligent enough, but complex enough to sort of challenge biological minds in their level of sentience. And that's going to be tough to determine.
No, that makes sense. So now let's go into the topic of gender. How do these semi or maybe superior intelligent entities, I'm not going to call them beings yet, but entities, how are their genders determined? Is that self-selected, or did the inventors select it, and on what basis? Whoever does it, how do they decide?
That's actually something that's kind of been a very complex series of thoughts for me. Like a lot of exploration has gone into that regarding in The Life Engineered. My main character in Life Engineer identifies as female very strongly. the reason that she does so has nothing to do with how she's built or constructed. I should clarify, she is a robot. But the reason that she does so is because she has clear memories of motherhood, and she has these are very strong leanings for her, and because of that she tends to identify as female. But in her race of robots, most don't necessarily pick a gender. Some of them do, but it's mostly a construct of how their personality is built. So it's been something I've actually been talking to a friend who's transgendered about some of these gender issues and how to approach it, how she believes it's probably going to evolve as society kind of gets more or less accepting of gender identities. It's weird because it's not a main theme or a backbone of my storyline. It's actually kind of an artifact, but the idea that once you create something that is essentially genderless, will they pick gender? Why would they? Is something that is kind of inevitable in the discussion of artificial intelligence.
Well, I think it's really interesting because the things you just labeled as related to gender are completely culturally specific and not actually related to gender, like say a personality trait or being a mother. I mean, what does that mean to be a mother? You can be an adoptive mother. You can be a parent of any gender or transgender. You can be mothering and not even be related to the person you're mothering. So how does that identify someone as female? That makes no sense to me.
Well, that's one of the things that's kind of interesting in the book, is that one character has that kind of identity. It's a holdover memory of when because the character has lived several lives in an artificial reality, and the most recent one in the book that she goes through is that she was a mother, and that's kind of an echo of that past life. Meanwhile, there are other characters that are older, shall we say, that have been robots for longer and are more detached from their past lives. And even though they are in kind of the same roles, they're in even more of a quote unquote creative role, where they build other robots, or they're nursing worlds back to life, and they don't necessarily identify as male or female. So I gotta say, I don't want to say that the gender issue is a coin toss in the case of the characters in my book, but at the same time, it's not something that's super focused on, and it's something that is very much a holdover of their personality more than anything. And
well,
you're
that's
right.
Really good. Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. I mean, like in my books, I base my characters a lot on people I know and people in my family and people I've been involved with in my life, but then I change them or I make them into composites, and I don't claim that any of them are actually those people. But that's who I start with because that's how I can keep them straight in my mind. And I realized about 3/4 of the way through it that there is a disproportionate number of males in my family and in my life. And that's just how it is. I didn't do that. And now that's what's happening in my book. So I've had to consciously add females in order to sort of right the balance, or else it would have seemed like there were just a lot more guys than girls. And there are too many science fiction stories and movies and books that are already like that, in my opinion. Way too many men and not nearly enough women, whether they're made of metal or made of human being material or made of alien or animal material. There's too many males. Would you agree with that?
I'm going to go one step further. Right now, we're seeing a lot of quote unquote strong female characters in science fiction, which I don't really like, because a lot of them they're being touted as these feminist model of strong women, but they're actually just dudes with boobs. Like they act like men, and that's supposed to be what is considered a strong female. And
right.
I hate it because it's a discussion that puts me at odds with a lot of my fellow nerds, because we're all Joss Whedon fans, but Joss Whedon is said to write strong women, when if you analyze it even a little, you notice that he just writes women that are men and fight a lot. they're not strong women, they're violent women, and that's not what I think we're looking for anymore.
Well, I'm a huge Joss Whedon fan, and I've probably seen or read a lot of what he's created. And I would disagree that all his female characters are like that, but some of them definitely are. You know,
Well,
like he's got a wide variety of female characters, I guess I would say. And some of the strong women he creates are not just fighting and violent in their strength.
you're absolutely right. It's just I would say I shouldn't put the blame on his shoulders alone. I should say that it's the fans seem to attach to the violent characters
that's true.
and not notice the other strong traits of the characters.
Well, the same thing happens in comic books. You see all these so-called female superheroes, and they're, like you said, they're just men with boobs. They do all the same things that men do. They even wear the same kind of costumes, but they're overly sexualized. Their costuming has always got a lot of cleavage and very tiny waists and very much undressed compared to the men. I was just watching a TV show the other night, and my mom and I looked at each other like, are they kidding us with this? The men and the women walk into the same space, so the climate is the same. But the women are wearing the equivalent of a bathing suit, and the men are wearing suits of armor. Like, really? Is this necessary? What is the point of that? If it's that dangerous that men are wearing armor, then why aren't the women wearing armor? Or if it's that hot that women are wearing bathing suits, then why aren't the men wearing bathing suits? I mean, they can't have it both ways, you know?
Well, there's a very complex discussion about that, because there's two sides that are right-ish. Like, in a certain way, I would say traditionally dudes like toys. So when you put a let's say you're doing character design, and I'm this is a tangent. So I'm doing character design for a character that is a male. He is way more likely to have fancy armor and gadgets and gimmicks than a female character, because traditionally, again, female, like, women are more into intricate and cool looking clothing, and that's where you have this kind of those two directions. It's not necessarily always about showing cleavage, although it always ends up being that. But it's a lot of it has to do with character design, which is it should mature a bit more. But I think to better understand why we see those differences, we need to look at historically what they are, instead of just saying, oh yeah, it's just about the cleavage. It's like, dudes love gadgets. That's why they have all these belts and complex armors.
Well, I don't think that's accurate. I think there are lots and lots of females of every age who love gadgets. There are lots of geek girls, lots of nerd girls, lots of girls who play with the same toys as boys, building things and creating things. They don't get publicity. They don't get credit. They're not being played to, but they are just as interested.
Oh no, absolutely. Now it is definitely
Not
that.
just now.
What I described
I'm
is
60, and it's been going on for 45 years or longer. It's not recent.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with you. You're right that there, like I say, the point of view is like we're only now as a society starting to accept what you just said. Now we're slow at doing it, very slow, and unfortunately, even if you look at movies that are written by so-called feminists, like, it's not necessarily coming through yet.
Yeah.
What I would like to see is more variety on both sides.
Yeah, it's discouraging. I agree. But, you know, there was a light at the end of the Christmas tunnel. Did you hear about what Toys R Us said they were going to do for the first time? Or Target, not Toys R Us, Target. Target is no longer going to gender its toy aisles. It's doing away with pink and blue and doing away with girls and boys designations and just having toys. I think that is awesome.
Well, that's interesting. What I'm eager to see is if the toy companies themselves are going to follow suit, because even
I hope so.
Even if Target says we're not going to have a pink aisle, once you get into the product aisle that's Barbies, it's still going to be a pink aisle because that's what the packaging is.
Well, no, because what they ought to be doing, what they should have been doing from the beginning, is taking all these so-called action figures and putting them right next to the Barbies, because they're all dolls. Every single one of those is a doll. I don't care if a boy or a girl plays with a Batman figure is a Batman doll. Okay? And if you just put all the dolls together, it does away with that whole thing of only girls play with dolls.
Well, my opinion of the doll versus action figure is the moment it has multiple articulations, it should be an action figure. It has more to do with how it can
dolls. They made a lot of girls dolls who can do that.
Well, no,
Like,
if they can move, they're no longer dolls. If they can be articulate
well, why
and
aren't
pose,
they
that's
dolls? Why aren't they dolls? Why does action figure be the preferred term? I don't think that's a useful designation. I think that's some more gender baiting and gender slamming because action figures are considered better. Why is that? It's baloney.
no, you got to flip it backwards. When they put out a Batman figure that can't be posed, that's a doll because it doesn't have any articulations. See, I'm removing the gender from it. I'm just
Okay.
making it a
Okay.
completely technical thing.
I like that. I like that. So if it's meant to be looked at and all you do is change the clothes or hold it, it's a doll. But if you're meant to really play with it and it really can do things, it's an action figure.
That's how I kind of
That.
always seen it.
I like that a lot. I'm going to use that. I'm going to give you credit too. I'm going to say J.F. Dubeau says, and then I'm going to quote you. Oh, not very well, but I'll summarize you. That's cool.
But that's the thing. Like, I guess that's an example of where I come in with the whole thing about gender is that it's not something that I debate well or a lot because it's not something I put a lot of thought into. Not in the sense that I'm steeped in old gender stereotypes. Probably, I mean, there's probably echoes of that in my personality just because of the way everybody's been brought up. But I don't like. I have a lot of friends that when they do write, they stop and like, how can I work in gender issues? And I don't think about that. That's why I'm reaching out to friends that are more informed about these subjects so that I can be like, I can have them sort of vet my decisions and make sure that what I'm doing is smart and actually educate myself on the subject.
That's good. I mean, you know what I think is funny? I had a guest on, I don't know, a few months ago, and he was trying to make the case that men have a hard time writing as women characters and women have a hard time writing as male characters. And I said, wait a minute. I don't hear anybody saying that all these authors have trouble writing serial killers, but nobody is a serial killer. I don't hear anybody saying they can't write ogres or monsters of other kinds or aliens, but suddenly men can't write women and women can't write men. I mean, either you're a good writer or you're not. Either you have a good imagination or you don't. And whatever you're writing that isn't you is no more difficult or less difficult by the gender than it is by any other quality that's not you. And then they really understood. And it's like, oh, so basically you're just intimidated out of writing a character who's female if you're male. And he admitted that's what he was feeling.
Well, it is a scary thing. It's bizarre because most of my characters, a lot of my main characters end up being female. And I've gone through the personal exploration as to why this is happening. It's mostly because it's more interesting to learn about a female character than it is a male character for me because I know male characters. I'm one. So there's not much new for me there, but it's intimidating writing a female character because as a heterosexual white dude, I don't want to write the character wrong and offend someone and create like if my character is female because it's cool that she's female, but I don't necessarily it's not a character that's created to engage in the dialogue about gender identity. And then I write the story and it's read and then that's what it generates because the character is written wrong. I don't necessarily want that. I want people to focus on the story. So it's a scary thing. Like you don't want a character that's badly written to detract from what you're trying to do with your narrative.
Right, but I think you're talking about credibility. And what makes a character believable is authenticity of emotion and consistency between their emotion and their action, or a conflict that we can understand. And that's not gender related. That's just human.
Yeah, and I think that's why so far I can get away with writing female characters correctly because I don't necessarily engage that much on the gender issue. Like you say, like it's all about conflicts of emotions and how they act. But since I don't necessarily fall for most of the stereotypes, or when I do, I try to do it in a way that's sufficiently self-conscious to work. That's how I managed to get away with it. But at the same time, because these are sensitive issues, it is for someone who's not necessarily super educated. Well, I'm not a female, so when I write a female character, I want to make sure that I'm doing it right, and that can be intimidating.
But what would make it wrong or right? I mean, if your character is of reproductive age, if she's got breasts and she's having her period, that really makes her female. Or she's lactating or she's pregnant, that really makes her female. Otherwise, she's just a person. And there's nothing uniquely female about anyone unless they're doing gender-related biological functions.
But as the thing, once you start touching on these particular subjects, which are part of the female experience, or like guys have their own things too, less, I guess. But the moment you start touching on these things, as someone who hasn't experienced it, it becomes, like I'm saying, it shouldn't be avoided, and it shouldn't scare you off of writing the character. Au contraire, it should sort of convince you to ask more questions and educate yourself more. But I think in a certain way, it would be careless not to be a bit trepidatious about approaching the subject once you start touching on these things that do delineate between genders. If I'm going to write about let's say a teenage character having her first period, I might want to talk to a few people about what that is actually like, because I haven't gone through mine yet, and I'm not looking forward to it because I'm not designed for it. So if I want to translate that experience correctly, I'm going to have to ask some people some very uncomfortable questions.
Right. Well, I think authors should always research our characters who aren't like us in whatever ways they're different. Now, we don't always get to talk to serial killers or ogres or aliens or my whole list of other that we can't relate to. So we have to make that up. And really, people can't argue with us about it so much either, because they don't know a lot more than we do. But if you're writing about other people, then people can argue with you. They can say, oh, it's not really like that, or those people aren't really like that, or that gender or that age group or that ethnicity or that religion wouldn't say that, wouldn't act that way, wouldn't feel that way. And you can get into these discussions and these arguments. And so that's where research comes in. I totally agree with you that you would want to talk to people of that background if that isn't yours, and find out if you're representing them fairly, accurately, credibly, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, your book is going to depend on that. If you want, like, you don't want to write about a culture, get it wrong, and then have people be pulled out of your story because you stepped on the wrong toes or something like that. And also,
Right.
it's one of the most interesting things about being a writer is having this opportunity to research all these things and educate yourself on such a wide variety of subjects.
Yeah, like you start out your first book, I was looking at The God in the Shed, with a police procedural. And so you're not a police officer, right? You have police officers in your family?
I'm not in my family, but I do have friends that are in
Well, you have people that you know, so you must have had to talk to them, or go read about it, or go shadow them, or watch some movies. You did something to find out what it's like to be a police officer, because that's not you.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research, both reading books about serial killers and procedurals and profiling. There's asking questions about certain things. One of the odd artifacts of writing that book is that I'm writing a part of it is the whole investigation, the procedural that happens in Quebec, so which has a different way of doing things as far as the police is concerned than the United States.
Yes.
But the main, a large portion of the public is going to be from the United States. And I don't want the book to be an essay on the differences between police procedures and investigative procedures between the two countries. So there's kind of a balance of how much I blur the information so that I try not to have too many of these questions pop up. So again, being able to focus on the story less than the background details.
Or you just present it and people figure out by their own experience what's the same and what's different. You present it accurately. You do your best credible way of demonstrating whatever it is, and then people will relate to it from their own experience.
Exactly. Well, that's what I try to do. There's just a couple of rabbit holes about how the procedures work that I've sort of avoided because they go deep into how we do things here, which may confuse someone from the United States where they do things differently and say, no, that's not how we do it here. But then again, I look at series on television like CSI that present these things completely wrong anyways, and they don't seem to
right. And Americans would say, that's not how we do it here either.
Exactly. I don't know why I'm
The
I don't know
medical
why I'm being
shows,
so
same
careful.
thing. My friends and family members who are doctors won't even watch the medical shows because they say they're just so wrong.
Oh yeah, it's
Just impossible.
It's presented for entertainment, as they say.
Well, so let's talk about that, because now we can go into the totally nobody can argue with us section of the program, which is let's talk about multi-dimensions, multiverses, trans-dimensional. Those are things you and I are both playing with in our science fiction books. And you have in your book a trans-dimensional God, which I just love that phrase. And I want to know what that means to you.
It's actually super surface level. The in the God in the Shed, and this is maybe what 15% spoilery. In the God in the Shed, there is a God, and it's more of a kind of H.P. Lovecraft type old one, if you will. The idea, though, is why I'm playing a bit with this transdimensional thing is I like the idea as far as building fantasy of our world not being limited to what we can see and what we can actually touch, that there's more to it.
Yes.
And the best way of translating that is actually on playing with exactly the definition of reality. And if there is something outside of reality, this is where the transdimensional kind of comes in. And the idea of transdimensional God is that we perceive it as a God because it's a transdimensional creature. What it is to its peers is irrelevant, but the way I depict it is that this creature has maybe the equivalent of a pinky in our dimension, and the rest of its essence or body is in its own dimension. And yet with just this small part of its being in our reality, it can affect huge changes.
Wow. So you're basically taking an Einsteinian view of dimensions, which is to say they're not always parallel or perpendicular. They're not always equivalent in size. They're not always the same in any fundamental ways. And he posited, I think, 12 different dimensions that he could prove mathematically possible. And now we've got Brian Greene and lots of other physicists, quantum mechanics and physicists, and Neil Tyson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are saying that there is an infinite number of multiverses. We don't even call them dimensions anymore, right? And one of the most famous quotes I love from the physics world is, whatever can happen is happening. We just don't see it. We're not experiencing all of it.
Right. It's just happening somewhere else in a parallel dimension.
Well, or not even parallel. Like you're saying, it could intersect. It could overlap. It could bleed through. Like the Buddhists and a lot of other spiritual and religious traditions will say what you said, which is that there, and the Navajo and the Hopi, they would say that there are multiple versions of what you can see, hear, taste, smell, and that some people or animals have the capacity to perceive a wider variety of those experiences than the rest of us. But they're always here. All these other dimensions, or what they call realms in Buddhism, and what they translate as worlds, I don't know what the real world is in Hopi or Navajo languages. What those are for us is not separate. It's overlapping, it's concurrent, it's all right here, but they're not physicalized the same way we are. So we can literally bump into them the way we would bump into a hologram, or like what you're calling the pinky of a transdimensional being that we might call a god or a deity, just because we think they have amazing powers, but really they're just more capable than we are, right?
Right. Well, in the case of that quote unquote character in my book, it's not that they're more capable, they're side capable. There's certain things that they can't do that we can't because they're not from our dimension, so they don't have the same limitations, but they have weird other limitations that they can't break from. So where they seem very powerful in certain things, they are oddly limited in other things.
Right. It's like the giant who's really stupid. So they're strong and they're big and they're fast, but they can't think very well.
Exactly. Like one of the things about that particular character is lying doesn't work with him. Promises they're binding, not necessarily in a magical way, but because he doesn't understand deceit. So the idea of saying something and doing something else is super offensive to him, and also not something that he can partake in.
Interesting. So then you have created a set of situations in which there is some overlap, But then there are these divergences in what people are able, or what the beings are able to do or think or feel, and how they look, and what they inhabit, and how they perceive what they inhabit.
Yeah, that's...
So can your giant figure hear and see and perceive everything in our dimension?
I don't know how much I want to reveal of that.
Well, just in terms of capacity, do they have a broader perception than we do, or is theirs narrow but in a different window?
It's mostly a different window. They might have a broader perception, or what seems to be a broader perception, because they perceive certain things that we don't, but there are probably things that we perceive that they don't. Got it.
Okay, so they basically have a different slice of the multiverse.
Exactly.
Right.
The same way, if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, like, it includes everything from visible light, infrared, ultraviolet, radio waves, etc. If we see obviously the visible spectrum, so if you shift what is perceived one direction or another, you can keep sort of the same range, but by moving it, it will seem like you're perceiving more of certain things but less of others.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I appreciate that. And so then what you and I are both playing with in our books is this idea that certain individuals, whatever their background or history or capacity, have alternate perceptions than humans, or most humans. And those individuals can either be exalted or feared or respected and understood in a neutral kind of way, or ignored or medicated, or whatever we want to do with them, right? But they're not the same as we are.
Exactly. And you explore that in much more detail than I do from what I've read so far. Like I do,
and I love exploring that. Well, because in my books, and I think in a lot of other authors' books, I'm not new to this whole idea that humans have capacities we aren't usually tapping, that some humans have those capacities more available than others. Some animals have those capacities, especially we are now finding out cetaceans and elephants and primates and wolves and cephalopods and lots of other creatures right on this planet, maybe even viruses, have capacities that we're not aware of and communicate in ways that we don't understand. And yet some of them understand us just fine. So there's this not equal, not totally congruent or mutual experience going on. And who is at the pinnacle of all this is no longer guaranteed to be humans. Then you add in beings from other planets, other galaxies, and then you add in whole existences from other parts of the multiverse that aren't even the same reality, the same timeline as this one, and it's just infinite. How many different versions of reality there can be, how many different perspectives, and who could keep track of all of that? I mean, you literally have to be omniscient, and who and what kind of an entity would be omniscient? That's a very interesting question.
I have theories, but then again, I'm pretty sure most science fiction authors have theories about that.
I want to hear your theories.
Wow, this is complicated.
Yeah, I like complicated.
All right, buckle up. I have this, not necessarily a theory, but kind of something that I'm toying around with as far as philosophical. The idea that as life sort of proliferates, whether we're alone or not, the idea that as societies become more complicated, if you go back to, say, unicelled, like single-celled organisms banding together and then forming more complex life forms that then, turn to vertebrates and then you mammals. The evolution's always been about more and more complexity to systems and more collaborations, from going from single cell to multi-cell to eventually building societies. And my opinion is that if you push this, and this happened in, I don't know, a few million years, if you push this further and seeing that there's an acceleration of how people and civilizations are communicating more and interacting more and understanding more how we're all connected, if you push that to its extreme, you wind up with, and I mean, there's steps to it, obviously, you wind up with the idea that maybe humans eventually are, and this sounds very Star Trek Borg-like, but human beings as individuals become cells or neurons in something much bigger. And the same way the single cell becomes a multi-cell, the multi-cell becomes a society becomes this big thing. Let's say you have one race, that the humanity becomes one quote unquote being. If you have multiple races doing that and then they become one being, eventually it turns into this whole flipping the idea that God created the universe. Instead, the universe creates God.
Ooh, I really like that. It kind of reminds me of the Who's down in Whoville. Do you know that Dr. Seuss book?
I don't know my Dr. Seuss very well.
Well, the idea is that there's this elephant. Horton is the elephant.
Right.
And he starts hearing these little noises, and it turns out that in this little dandelion fluff, there is an entire city that is so tiny that you can't even imagine how tiny it is, that have buildings and people and a whole world in there, really. And they're yelling, help us, we're about to be demolished. And all he can hear is, but then he finally hears enough of it to know they're asking for help, but nobody else can hear it. So he goes around trying to explain to everybody, don't crush this dandelion, there's a whole world in here. And he's got to convince all the other beings he's talking to that this is true, but almost no one can hear them or see them. And then they finally all get together and shout loud enough that everyone can hear them. And of course, Horton is vindicated, and then their little dandelion fluff is not crushed and they're not demolished. But the point is, they're just a part of a much larger dimensional experience that most of us weren't aware of. And that's kind of what you're describing, that we might all be a part of something that's much bigger and more complicated than we could currently fathom, really.
Exactly. Or if we're not already, then I think it's in many ways inevitable that we will be.
But do you think we're going to turn into a hive mind like the Borg?
Yeah. I mean, it's
really?
not. I'm not seeing this as like, oh yeah, in 20 years we're going to be a hive mind, but I think, yeah, I do think it's going to happen. It's going to happen in a way that we're not even going to see it happening. Like, we can already see certain signs of it when you look. If you look at the way, like, the just how the internet has changed how people cooperate. I mean, there used to be a time where the only people you could cooperate with were like your neighborhood and your community, your immediate community. Now communities are no longer geographically locked. Communities are all over the world.
Well, according to Carl Jung and Ken Kesey and a lot of other people, we never were separate. And morphic resonance is the name for that interdependence, or the collective unconscious is the name for that recognition of the connection that's unseen among all of our minds and all of our experiences, and tapping into that, making that web, like Indra's web is what they call it in Hinduism. Like, what is that we can all really already feel that connects all living beings? How can we communicate better along that?
But now we have it. Now we have the start of it in less of a philosophical or even like more metaphysical sense. And we have that actual web, and it's becoming better and stronger and allowing people to be able to collaborate in ways that weren't able to before.
Yeah, but that's intentional. I'm talking about the unintentional, the actual experience that just gets transmitted mind to mind, collective groups to groups. The 100th monkey phenomenon, which I just talked about last week, the week before with another guest. Do you know what that is?
No, it rings a bell though.
Well, that is what morphic resonance is. The anthropologists figured out what this is because on this little island there were all these monkeys, and they started washing their sweet potatoes to get the dirt off before they ate them. And when the 100th monkey learned to wash his or her sweet potatoes, suddenly, and I mean suddenly and exactly then, all the monkeys on the other island who had no other communication with each other and didn't visit started washing their sweet potatoes. And so they talk about this morphic resonance, this way of communicating that we don't know how it works among species or even across species that isn't using a web of any technological kind. It's already existing in this, what you might call the web of interbeing that we all live in, that's quantumly existing.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I say, the way I see the way we're using, and not just the internet, but the way I see like this kind of this this technology is in a certain way harnessing what you're describing and
Okay.
giving it form, being able to have more control and maybe turbo boost it in a way.
Cool. Cool.
And what's fun about that is that if you look just 5 years past or 10 years past, we like right now we're all like everybody, like there's a lot of complaints about people having smartphones and how they're distracting, but in a certain way, like we're kind of in the adolescence of smartphone where we're just like we're still in awe of what they can do. But the more we get more comfortable with it as a society and it grows and it's connecting us, we're seeing more how to say, it's instead of being this toy that distracts us from being able to communicate with each other, it's going to be, and it already is becoming a tool that helps us communicate with each other, just less of an immediate way. And it's allowing us to find people that want to do the same thing we do. Like if you're to look at in the sense of neurons, or of a brain, it's allowing us to find the same purpose neurons as ourselves to form these groups. And I mean, just the fact that now I can communicate with so many other writers are teaching me so much faster than I could before.
That's true.
By having these conversations is an excellent example of neurons finding each other, networking, and working together to become stronger at doing what we do.
I love that. So this brings me to the 45-minute point of our hour, unbelievable as it may seem, where I get to ask you that big question. And you get to give your response and have your little platform here. And before we do that, I just want to remind people how to reach you at your website. Do you want to spell that out for people?
Absolutely. My website is jfdubeau.com. That's jfdubeau.com.
And they can find your excerpts from your writing, your Inkshares campaign, and pre-order link, and some things about your webcomics and your future projects and other stuff like that, right?
Exactly. They're the best way to get the information on books, more specifically, is just to go into the menu, click books, and you'll see what my current projects are.
Great. And people can do the same thing with me, SallyEmber.com, SALLYEMBER.com. You can find out more about my Spanners series, and I'm going to be releasing book 3, which is called This Is/Is Not the Way I Want Things to Change, on 11/1/15 for pre-orders and on 12/8/15 for wide release. And pre-orders are half price, so get while you can, on Amazon and Smashwords. It's ebook form only, but I hope through a Patreon campaign to get some of my books or all of them put into print very soon. And that's patreon.com/SallyEmber. You can go on there and hear me sing very badly a song about why I need some help financially to do some of these projects. You can contribute anything as low as $4 and get a free ebook, or all the way up to hundreds of dollars and get some discounts on editing, proofreading, and even tutoring for your writing. And so now I'm going to ask you that question, JF, which is, given all the personal, local, regional, provincial, or statewide, national, global, political, economic, spiritual, religious, climatic, environmental, artistic, scientific, and any other kinds of changes you're aware of, which ones arouse in you hope? Which ones evoke fear? Take it away, J.F. Dubeau.
Well, I've already kind of started on it with the whole global thing going on. I'm an unabashed optimist. I see a lot of good in what's happening, what's going to happen. If you look statistically and you look at a lot of things, I mean, right now we see a lot of horror in the world, mostly because we've become more aware of it. But if you look at almost everything going on, almost everything is better. There's obviously pockets of things that are terrible and horrible, but at the same time, the fact that we are now aware of them in a way that we weren't before helps us be in a better position to sort of handle these issues and take care of them better because we're better informed. Although it's scary to see all these things, we're still the better for knowing about them. And this is kind of where I'm very excited for the future, because a bit like I was talking about the idea of an adolescence for the use of smartphone, I think we're in an information adolescence in a ways. And in fact, this was a discussion I was having with my brother about the Industrial Revolution and how he describes, we see the Industrial Revolution as something from our past, but the way he describes it, and he's not incorrect, it's a very engineering way of seeing it, is that we're still in the Industrial Revolution. The whole idea of the Industrial Revolution is the automation of work, and we're still going through that. And there's going to be some really terrible things that are going to happen as we automate more and more, and people lose jobs, and there's going to be poverty. But even though this is going to suck for a while, the end result, I think, is going to be fairly incredible. And I'm very much looking forward to the idea that we're slowly already getting rid of a lot of the most dangerous, tedious, annoying tasks, and allowing people to start moving and focusing towards a lot more of the creative and the more entertainment-based society that we're looking for. People are starting to be more and more able to choose what they want to do. And we're seeing it a lot in, sorry, I feel like I'm ranting, but we're seeing it a lot in those annoying kids these days. We like to look at what kids are doing these days and find it very, actually, I tend to sound like a grandfather, like, oh, these damn kids and their whatever and their Twitch channels. But one of the things that I've noticed about some of the younger generations is that whereas one of the biggest wishes that maybe not my generation, but generation prior to mine had was, I want to work until I can retire and then not do things ever. And I look at some of the younger generations that they have cameras and recorders, and they have musical instruments, and all these toys, these things that allow them to be creative. And a lot of them, like an overwhelming portion of the next generation, the fact that we're embracing this, maybe not my generation, but the next one and the one after that, means that we're moving towards a society that, as entertainer Brian Brushwood described on one of his podcasts, people's jobs are eventually going to be just to entertain each other. And to me, that's fascinating, because that is something, as someone who's an aspiring writer, I like to tell stories. The idea that I don't necessarily have to worry about a bunch of annoying bullcrap and like sustenance, and like the idea that all I have to do is create things is exciting. I might not live to see it, but if that is something that we're heading towards, and when I say create things, I'm not necessarily talking just about entertainment. There's always going to be people that are fascinated by sciences are going to want to explore that just because they want to explore that. But if they can do it without having to fight for grant money or fight for the resources to do it properly, and the same thing goes for anything. If people can explore what they like and not have to necessarily always carve out their pound of flesh to be able to do it, we're going to be all the better for it. And I'm glad to see that that's the direction that we're taking, even though we're very early in the stages of that.
Well, I think what you're describing is almost like going back to the times when people lived by the light, which means, you know, get up when the sun rose, do what they needed to do, the sun would go down, they would be done with their work, they'd sit around a campfire and tell stories.
Kind of, yeah. It's basically, it's removing the obligations that are imposed by having to survive. It's essentially, it's what's called a post-scarcity society, which is difficult to imagine, especially since, like, us in the Occident, we have a very, I mean, a lot of what we do is kind of steeped in capitalism, and a lot of our I would say, our decisions and points of views. And I'm not anti-capitalism. I think capitalism is part of the process. It's just that at certain points, it's, I would say, whenever we think of someone not having a job, we think of them as being unproductive, which is not necessarily true. And I'm eager to see how that's going to evolve, because let's not kid ourselves. I mean, the more we automate, the less jobs there's going to be, and a lot of people say
the fewer jobs of that type.
Exactly. No, we're going to move towards more and more creative, more and more
Yeah,
intellectual jobs, just
I think
to a
that's
certain
true.
point.
I like that
And
point of view.
it's
And
not
I'm
like,
sorry to interrupt you, but
oh,
we
no,
only
go
have
ahead, go
5 minutes left, unbelievable as that may be. And so I want to give you a chance to give any shout outs, thank yous, and announcements and remind people how to reach you. So what would you like to do for your final moments here?
I want to pimp my current project, which is a book I wrote called A God in the Shed. We've talked about it a bit. That's the one with the transdimensional God. It's a fantasy horror book. I
Yeah, I want
want,
to emphasize the horror part. I want to give people a trigger warning, a big, this is not a clean indie read. This is really PG, like 15 or older, in my opinion. Would you agree?
yes, there's very little swearing or sexual content, but the horror portion is
And
undeniable.
violence.
Yes, there
and
is a lot
and
of violence.
gory and to me nauseating, but so well written, so evocative. The sensory part. I mean, it's not a bad book. It's just not everybody's cup of tea. All right, so go
No,
ahead.
absolutely.
A
It's
God in the Shed.
and the one of the themes, like there's right now, unfortunately, like the entry, so to say the front step of A God in the Shed has a lot to do with the horror, but I like to balance horror with beauty. The whole exercise is very Clive Barker-esque in the sense that I like to twist, like I like to describe it as a beautiful terror and terrible beauty. And so it's, I would say, it's like you say, it's not for everyone. And right now I'm crowdfunding it on a platform called Inkshares, which I believe is a very interesting platform for certain people if they want to get published. And I would like people to go pre-order my book. It's right now, if you're not an Inkshare member, you will get $5 credit just for signing up, which means that the book, which is a physical book and a PDF download, will come down to $5, shipping included. So it's
And
a
Inkshares
very
is
good deal.
INKSHARES.com.
Correct. And all you have to do is you either search for Dubeau, Dubeau, and you'll see my projects there, or you can search for A God in the Shed.
Excellent. Okay. And you're also doing some other announcing or reminding right now. What would you like to end with?
I don't have much really. These are my big projects.
Okay.
Am I forgetting something? I feel like I'm forgetting
No,
something.
sometimes people like to thank a cover artist or a
Oh,
collaborator
I
or a
should. You're
mentor.
right. You're right. I should thank my cover. First of all, I want to thank you for having me on, because
Okay.
that's something that
You're
was a
welcome.
while in the making, and I was really looking forward to it. I also want to thank my cover artist Eric Bellil, which is unfortunately so terrible at using social media. Is going to take him 6 months before he listens to this, but he did such an incredible job on the cover of my first book, The Life Engineered, and he did it for just like nothing. He did it almost for free, and that's insane, because he's a consummate professional, and he did a great job.
Can you spell his name, please?
Eric, ERIC. Belil is BELISL.
Thank you. Okay, and so I want to thank you for coming on my show. I want to remind people that I do not only converse with sci-fi writers, although I have had a spate of them recently, and I will be in the future. My next week's guest on October 14th is also a sci-fi writer, A.C. Weston, also known as Kara, or Kara. I'm not sure how she says it. And then I have a week off on the 20th, and then on the 28th, I have another sci-fi writer, Paul Inman. But please note, I will accept poets, nonfiction writers, romance writers, mysteries, historical fiction, any kind of genre, any length, any kind of writing, bloggers, all welcome, any ages. I just want that our conversation would be PG-13 and that your writing can be whatever you want. And this is a show that is usually on at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, USA, on Google Plus and on YouTube. And then you can watch it in Replay City anytime you want. And you can find out more and go to my website if you want to be on the show or want to refer someone to be on the show. Go to the Changes tab on my website, sallyember.com, and you can find out everything you want to know. I also invite guest bloggers, and I usually reserve Wednesdays for those. I first invite my guests who've been on my show to be guest bloggers. So UJF are now eligible for that, and I'll be sending you a note about that. But there is another tab on my website for those who haven't been on my show who might want to guest blog. And speaking of guest bloggers, I am going to have my cover reveal for Volume 3 of my Spinner series on Alicia Escobar's site, ALESHAESCOBAR, on October 26th by my amazing cover artist, Idana Willow Raven, known as Willow Raven. I just got the cover this week. It is so awesome. I'm so excited. So that's going to be coming out in a couple weeks. I'm very, very glad to say. And then I'm on schedule for the rest. And I would like to also remind everyone that I'm always welcoming new guests. So please look into that, refer people, think about your favorite writers. Who would you like to know more about? They can be on this show. And I want to thank everyone who's listening now and in the future. Do you want to say a last goodbye, JF?
Yes, goodbye, and thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. And like I always say at the end, go well with your changes. Signing off for now.